The pirates dared to board a huge cargo ship, confident of an easy victory. But the captain, an experienced sailor with impeccable composure, turned their daring capture into a trap they would remember for the rest of their lives. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching the video from. The horizon stretched in a perfect line between sea and sky, a faint golden haze softening the edges where light met water. It was just past dawn and the ocean lay in a rare state of calm, the kind of stillness that, to an inexperienced sailor, might feel like reassurance. To Captain James Caldwell, it was something else entirely. The quiet seas of the Gulf of Aden often wore this same mask before showing their true face. He knew that beyond this calm, danger often waited, unseen but not idle. James stood on the bridge of the Ocean Sentinel, the massive container vessel he commanded, scanning the instruments with the same measured focus he had carried for over 20 years at sea. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and skin darkened not just by the Louisiana sun of his youth, but by decades of salt and wind. His eyes were steady, a deep brown that seemed always to be assessing, calculating. Few things could shake him. The ocean had tried more than once, in storms and near collisions, but it had never succeeded. Born in a modest fishing town in Louisiana, James had grown up with the briny scent of marshlands and the sound of gulls overhead. His father, a fisherman who worked hard and spoke little, had taken him out in a small wooden boat long before the boy could see over the gunwale. His mother, a schoolteacher, had insisted that he learn discipline and patience, traits that later became his greatest weapons at sea. James still remembered the day that changed everything, a chance encounter with the captain of a visiting cargo ship who allowed the boy to step onto the bridge. Standing behind the captain's chair, seeing the expanse of ocean through wide glass panels, he had felt the pull of a destiny that would take him far from the small-town docks. He worked his way up from deckhand to officer, enduring years of long hours and proving himself on ships of every size, rusting fishing trawlers, coastal freighters, sleek modern tankers. Each vessel had taught him something: how to read a squall before the clouds formed, how to navigate without instruments when systems failed, how to keep men calm when the seas rose high enough to hide the sun. Now, as captain of the Ocean Sentinel, he commanded not only a ship worth millions, but the trust of the 27 crew members aboard. The Ocean Sentinel was a floating fortress of steel, stretching over 300 meters in length. Its hull, painted a muted slate blue, bore the scuffs of countless ports and the marks of storms weathered. Towers of containers rose on its deck in neat stacks, each one holding goods worth a small fortune. Electronics bound for Europe, auto parts for African markets, industrial machinery destined for the Middle East. Below deck, the thrum of the twin diesel engines was constant, a heartbeat that kept the vessel alive. The bridge was fitted with state-of-the-art radar, GPS navigation, and communication systems, but James still kept an old brass compass mounted near the helm, a reminder that even the most advanced equipment could fail, and a captain should never forget the fundamentals. That morning, the crew moved with the easy rhythm of routine. The engineers checked gauges in the engine room, their coveralls stained with oil. On deck, 2 able seamen tightened the steel lashings securing the container stacks, while another swept the salt from the walkways. In the galley, the cook's laughter spilled out as he flipped eggs on a hot skillet, calling out to anyone who passed the door. The sun was climbing, spilling gold across the water and lighting the bridge in a warm glow. James moved slowly from one side of the bridge to the other, peering out over the expanse of sea. On the chart table beside him, the plotted course curved through the Gulf of Aden, a stretch of water notorious for piracy, It was a route they had sailed before, but never without a measure of risk. Merchant ships transiting these waters were advised to travel in convoys, yet schedules and contracts rarely allowed for such precautions. The Sentinel, heavily loaded and moving at a steady pace, was a tempting target for anyone desperate enough to seize it. The captain's hand lingered on the binoculars hanging at the edge of the console, though he saw nothing unusual yet. The sea lay flat, the horizon unbroken except for the faint shimmer of heat rising from the surface. Somewhere, far off, there might be fishing boats, perhaps even other cargo ships, but to the naked eye there was only water and sky. Still, James felt it, a subtle tightening in his chest, the same feeling he'd had before storms and before run-ins with ships that didn't belong where they were. He remembered a night in the Strait of Malacca years earlier, when a sudden blip on the radar turned into a fast-approaching skiff carrying armed men. They had been driven off then, but only because he'd seen them coming and used the ship's wake to swamp their approach. It was not lost on him that the men who prowled these seas now were often better armed, better organized, and more determined. He adjusted the course by a few degrees, more out of instinct than necessity, the movement so slight no one else on the bridge would have thought much of it. He had learned that the smallest adjustments could sometimes make the difference between being an easy mark and staying invisible. Leaning over the control panel, he scanned the radar again. The screen was clean, a few distant returns that likely belonged to harmless craft. Still, his mind ran through possibilities. What he would do if a fast boat appeared from the haze, how quickly he could get his crew into the secure compartments below deck, how long they could hold out until help arrived. He knew the nearest naval patrol was hours away. Out here, a captain had to be ready to solve his own problems before anyone else could intervene. Below him, the ship moved steadily, slicing through the glassy swells. The wake spread out behind in long, straight lines, a perfect mark for anyone tracking their path. James's gaze followed it until it disappeared into the haze, then turned back to the horizon. Somewhere beyond it lay the narrowest point of their route, where the Somali coast came close enough to see. The charts marked it as a high-risk zone, and it was no secret that pirate groups operated from hidden coves along that shoreline. He checked his watch. They would enter that zone within the day. For now, there was nothing to do but maintain course and keep a sharper eye than usual. The crew didn't need to be alarmed yet. They worked better without the weight of fear on them. But James's thoughts stayed sharp, fixed on the silent truth every captain knew. The ocean might seem endless, but danger could cross it faster than anyone expected. The minutes stretched into hours, the sun climbing higher, casting sharper light across the deck. The hum of machinery, the slap of water against the hull, and the occasional call of a gull were the only sounds. Yet, in that quiet, James remained watchful. Calm seas were good for business, but they also made it easier for trouble to find you. By the time he poured himself a cup of coffee and returned to the forward windows, the light had shifted. He took another slow sweep of the horizon with his binoculars, and though he saw nothing yet, the feeling in his chest had not eased. Somewhere out there, beyond the line where water met sky, he felt certain something was moving toward them. He didn't know if it would come today or tomorrow, but he knew it was coming. When it did, he would be ready. The hours that followed moved in a measured rhythm, the ship's engines pushing the Ocean Sentinel through the steady morning swells. The pale gold of dawn had shifted into the clear, hard blue of late morning, and the air above the water shimmered faintly with heat. From the bridge, Captain James Caldwell had a view that stretched for miles in every direction, an unbroken panorama of sea and sky. The ship's wake fanned out behind them like the tail of an arrow, straight and unwavering. For the crew, it was another working day, their duties unchanged, their conversations carrying the lightness of routine. But James's mind had not strayed far from the uneasy pull he had felt earlier. It lingered in the back of his thoughts, a quiet reminder that calm seas were no guarantee of safety. He moved between the navigation console and the large forward windows, scanning both radar and horizon in the same careful sequence he had performed thousands of times before. The radar screen showed the familiar scatter of static, the occasional slow-moving mark that might belong to fishing vessels far off in the haze. Nothing that demanded alarm, at least not yet. He sipped his coffee, letting its bitterness ground him, and shifted his gaze to the open water. The sun's glare on the surface was bright enough to make him squint, but he kept looking, sweeping from port to starboard, pausing at any faint suggestion of movement. It was near midday when he first saw them, small shapes far on the eastern horizon, so faint they might have been tricks of light. He lifted the binoculars, adjusting the focus until the shapes sharpened. They were low in the water, moving faster than the sluggish fishing boats common to these waters. 3 of them, spread apart in a loose triangle, their bows cutting thin lines of white into the blue. From this distance he could not make out their occupants clearly, but something about the way they moved made the muscles in his neck tighten. Fishing boats tended to drift or meander, their course dictated by the unseen movement of schools beneath the surface. These vessels, though, had direction, purpose. He lowered the binoculars and glanced at the radar. The screen confirmed what he already knew. 3 returns, each moving at a steady clip toward his own position. James felt the faint shift inside himself that always came when suspicion hardened into certainty. The quiet morning was ending. He studied the spacing of the boats and knew almost at once what he was looking at. It was a pattern, one he had seen on tactical charts and heard about from other captains who had been less fortunate. One vessel would position itself ahead of the target ship, forcing it to alter course. Another would harry from the side, keeping the crew's attention fixed in 2 directions at once. The third, often the most dangerous, would remain out of sight as long as possible, closing in from a blind angle to deliver men directly onto the deck. He straightened slowly, considering his options. They were still far off. He could maintain speed and hope to pass before they drew close enough to act. He could alter course slightly, try to appear as though he had not noticed them, perhaps convincing them to give chase to a slower or less watchful vessel. But he knew these waters, and he knew the desperation of the men who prowled them. Once they had marked a target, they rarely let it go. He raised the binoculars again, and this time the details were clearer. Sunlight flashed off metal in the hands of some of the figures on deck, long, thin shapes he recognized instantly as rifles. The men moved with a readiness that had nothing to do with fishing. 2 of the boats had dark-painted hulls, the third a pale, weathered wood that might have once served as camouflage against the sand-colored coastline. The triangle formation was closing gradually, with the lead boat shifting subtly to angle across his projected path. On the deck below, the crew worked on, unaware. He could hear the distant thud of a hammer from the starboard side, the low rumble of an engine inspection from below. There was no need to raise the alarm yet, not until he was certain of his first move. He studied the speeds on the radar display, noting the calculated closing time. At their current pace, they would be within a kilometer in less than 20 minutes. That gave him time, but not much. The Gulf of Aden was vast, yet in moments like this it felt smaller than any harbor. Out here, a ship the size of the Ocean Sentinel was both fortress and trap, able to withstand storms, but vulnerable to the fast, nimble craft that could weave around its bulk. James knew that a container ship like his could not outrun such boats for long. Speed was not their defense. Their defense was awareness, preparation, and the skill of the captain to use the ship's mass and wake to his advantage. The sun had risen higher now, reflecting off the water in blinding flashes that danced across the bridge windows. He adjusted his stance, letting the shadow of the bulkhead shield his eyes, and kept watching. The movement of the boats was steady, patient, almost casual to an untrained eye. To James, it spoke of confidence. These men knew what they were doing. They had likely done it before. He thought briefly of the naval patrol zones marked on his charts, the safe corridors where coalition ships maintained watch. They were hours away from the nearest of those. The Ocean Sentinel was alone in this stretch, her position known only to her crew and now, it seemed, to the three approaching boats. James set his coffee aside and leaned over the engine controls. His fingers brushed the throttle levers, but he did not move them yet. A sudden change in speed now might be seen as a sign of awareness, and that could push the pirates into a more aggressive approach. Better to wait, to give himself the smallest element of surprise when the time came. He turned back to the forward windows, scanning the horizon one more time. The boats were closer now, their outlines sharper, the dark shapes of men visible against the glittering water. He imagined the sound of their engines, high, insistent, and growing louder with each minute. Soon the crew would notice. Soon he would have to speak. The captain's mind moved ahead, mapping the next hour in deliberate steps. He could use the Sentinel's ballast system to shift the vessel's weight, throwing larger waves into the path of the smaller boats. He could bring the ship about in a slow, wide turn to force them to adjust position. He could order the crew into the citadel, the secure compartments below deck, before the first grappling hook flew. But before any of that, he needed to be certain, beyond any doubt, that this was an attack. In these waters, mistakes carried heavy costs. A misjudged fishing crew could lead to diplomatic entanglements. A hesitation in the face of pirates could cost lives. James stepped back from the console, the hum of the instruments filling the brief silence. Outside, the three boats kept their slow, deliberate approach, the line between them tightening like the strands of a net. In the captain's mind, the calm sea had already begun to change. Somewhere beyond the reach of his eyes, he could feel the first pull of the current that marked the edge of the day's real test. He set his hands lightly on the rail in front of the bridge windows and drew a slow breath. Whatever the next hour brought, the Ocean Sentinel would meet it head-on, and he would be ready to decide how. The ocean around the Ocean Sentinel seemed to hold its breath. The three small boats, now clearly visible to the naked eye, had drawn closer in the last several minutes, their wakes cutting pale scars across the dark water. From the bridge, Captain James Caldwell studied them with the fixed intensity of a man who had learned to read danger as others read weather. Each approach, each subtle adjustment of their course, confirmed what his instincts had told him from the moment he first saw them on the horizon. This was no coincidence. These men were coming for his ship. He didn't sound the alarm, not yet. Panic was a tide that, once loosed among a crew, was difficult to reverse. Calm was his first line of defense. His hand rested lightly on the communications panel as he considered his words. He would tell them only what they needed to know, no more, no less. Lifting the handset, he spoke in a steady tone, his voice carrying the same calm authority it always did, but edged with a precision that made it impossible to mistake the seriousness behind it. The crew was instructed to move quietly to the designated secure compartments, deep within the hull, where steel and locked hatches could buy them time if the worst happened. These spaces, known as citadels, were stocked with water, food, and communications equipment, precautions mandated for ships crossing high-risk waters. Once he had given his orders, James returned to the central controls, his eyes flicking between the radar display and the sea ahead. The lead pirate boat had increased speed slightly, swinging to a position that would intercept the Sentinel's course. The second boat, farther to port, mirrored the maneuver, ready to force the ship into a narrowing channel between them. The third boat had dropped back, disappearing now and then in the troughs of the waves, a predator biding its time. James's mind moved quickly, weighing the ship's capabilities against the nimble aggressors. The Sentinel was a behemoth, built for endurance and cargo, not for speed. But size was its own weapon if handled correctly. He knew that a shift in ballast could create a heavy roll, throwing up waves large enough to challenge even the most skilled helmsman of a smaller craft. The right turn at the right moment could force an attacker into open water, robbing them of their advantage. It was a dance, one measured in degrees of rudder and seconds of timing. He began with the simplest move, adjusting speed by a fraction, subtle enough not to betray his intent. The deep engines responded with a low vibration through the deck plates, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to feel for. In the open water, the change might seem insignificant, but to the trained eye it shifted the timing of the intercept ever so slightly. The pirates would have to correct for it, and every correction cost them time. The water hissed and foamed along the hull as James eased the ship into a gradual turn, steering away from the line the lead boat sought to force on him. The ocean Sentinel's sheer bulk carved a broad curve through the swells, its wake spreading out in steep, sloping waves. The smaller vessels adjusted, their bows lifting and falling with the wash, engines whining as they fought to keep formation. He knew they wouldn't be deterred by this alone. These men had come too far, spent too much fuel to abandon the chase. In their minds, the Sentinel was a prize worth taking, its cargo worth a fortune on the black market. The problem for them was that James had no intention of playing the part of a compliant target. With another adjustment of the ballast system, he shifted the weight of the ship to starboard, exaggerating the roll into the waves. The result was immediate. The sea off the port side lifted in heavy swells that broke against the hull with booming crashes, sending spray high into the air. One of the pirate boats hesitated at the edge of the wake, forced to slow as the sharp peak slapped against its bow. It recovered quickly, but James noted the moment. Every hesitation was a small victory. From below came the distant thud of steel hatches being secured. The crew was locking themselves into the citadel compartments, just as they had drilled. He could picture them down there, faces tense, voices low, listening to the muffled roar of the engines and the slap of water against the hull. They knew the routine, but that didn't make the wait any easier. On deck, the air smelled faintly of diesel and salt. The sunlight struck the steel surfaces with a hard glare, glinting off the wet railings. James could see the shadow of the third boat now, skimming low and fast along the starboard quarter. It had used the distraction of his maneuvers to close the distance unseen. That was the danger of the third attacker, lurking outside the main line of sight until the moment to strike. He didn't have the luxury of ignoring them. If they managed to hook onto the hull with their grappling lines, the fight would change from a game of maneuver to a battle for control of the deck itself. His priority had to be keeping them off the ship entirely. The lead boat gunned its engine, spray fanning out from its sides. The men aboard were clearer now, thin, hard faces under sun-bleached caps, weapons gripped tight against their chests. One stood near the bow, gesturing towards the sentinel with a sweep of his arm, shouting something James couldn't hear over the wind and engine noise. James held the ship steady, letting the lead boat think it had the advantage for a moment longer. He wanted them to commit fully to their approach before he made his next move. Every meter they closed under false confidence was another meter he could use against them. Then, with a precise motion, he adjusted the rudder and shifted ballast again, rolling the ship heavily to port. The turn threw up another steep wake, the swell catching the lead boat broadside. It bucked and dipped, momentarily losing speed. The second boat swung wider to avoid the same fate, its crew bracing against the spray. But the third boat was undeterred. It darted forward, engine screaming, closing the last gap between itself and the Sentinel's starboard side. James's jaw tightened. They were committed now, and so was he. This was no longer a matter of if they would board. It was a matter of when and how. And if they thought he would make it easy for them, they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The moment the third boat's hull slammed against the Sentinel's starboard side, the sound echoed through the steel skin of the ship like a deep, metallic warning bell. James felt the vibration through the soles of his boots as he stood on the bridge, his eyes tracking the deck cameras. Grappling hooks arced through the sunlight, catching fast to the railings. Lines went taut, and then, like shadows spilling upward, the first pirates began to climb. They moved quickly, their bodies lean and wiry, muscles flexing as they pulled themselves hand over hand toward the deck. Within seconds, 5 of them had vaulted over the railing, boots hitting steel with a dull thud. James's pulse was steady, his breathing even, but inside his mind the tempo shifted into something sharper, faster. He knew once they were aboard, the game on the open water ended and another began. One played in corridors and compartments where every turn and doorway could be a trap. His orders to the crew had been clear. Stay hidden in the citadels, keep silent, and wait. That gave him the freedom to use the rest of the ship like a chessboard, each space a potential move in a larger strategy. From the bridge, he watched their first moments. The intruders paused briefly, scanning the wide expanse of deck, then exchanged quick, clipped words. Their rifles hung in practiced readiness. They didn't rush blindly. They'd done this before. He could see the calculation in the way they moved, not reckless, but deliberate, probing for resistance. The leader, a tall man with a dark scarf wrapped around his lower face, gestured, splitting them into 2 groups. 3 turned toward the cargo hold access points. The other 2 angled toward the superstructure that housed the crew quarters and navigation spaces. That split was what James had been waiting for. Separating their strength would make them easier to contain, and it gave him the chance to isolate one group without interference from the other. He keyed the internal comms to 2 of his most trusted officers who had remained with him until now. His voice was quiet but firm, instructing them to secure the citadel hatches from their side and then move to predetermined positions to assist in sealing off certain corridors. The aim wasn't to engage directly, not yet, but to corral, to channel the intruders exactly where he wanted them. He left the bridge, locking the heavy steel door behind him, and moved down into the ship's interior. The sounds changed as he descended from the open air into the enclosed spaces. The steady hum of the engines grew louder, a constant mechanical heartbeat beneath his feet. The air carried the mingled scents of machine oil, salt, and the faint metallic tang of the hull. His boots rang softly on the grated stairs, each step deliberate, each motion controlled. He knew the pirates would be moving cautiously. The Sentinel's layout was a labyrinth to the unfamiliar. Narrow corridors, bulkhead doors, multiple levels connected by steep ladders. For anyone who didn't know her, it was a place that could disorient in minutes. James intended to use that. He had left certain passageways open, others sealed, creating a funnel that would draw the intruders in the direction of the trap he'd prepared in the cargo hold. In the dim light of one of the lower passageways, he paused at a small control panel recessed into the wall. A quick sequence of key presses disengaged the lock on the aft cargo hold door and armed the triggers on the concealed locking mechanisms inside. The hold was vast, lined with stacks of containers in neat rows, but in one section he'd created a false cluster. A few containers positioned to look like they had been hurriedly moved, one left slightly open to reveal a tantalizing glimpse of what lay within. To an intruder looking for high-value goods, it would be irresistible. The bait was a shipment of sleek, boxed electronics, brand-new smartphones, their packaging pristine. They were genuine, worth enough on the black market to tempt any pirate. But in this case, they were nothing more than the cheese in the trap. Hidden inside the walls of the container were hydraulics rigged to slam the doors shut and seal them from the outside at the press of a button. Once triggered, there would be no escape without heavy tools, and the pirates wouldn't have those. James's earpiece crackled faintly, one of his officers whispering an update. The group of two had been seen on the crew quarters deck, moving cautiously toward the galley, their rifles sweeping every shadow. The larger group was in the central access corridor, heading toward the cargo hold just as planned. He acknowledged the message with a brief murmur and continued moving through the narrow service passage that paralleled their route, unseen. He reached a position behind a slatted maintenance grate, just above the hold. Through the narrow openings, he could see them now. 3 figures, their steps echoing on the steel deck plates, eyes flicking from the towering stacks of containers to the overhead catwalks. They were tense, but not wary enough. The sight of the half-open container drew them like a magnet. One approached first, pulling the door wider with a gloved hand. The glint of shrink-wrapped boxes inside caught in the dim light, and he called to the others in their language, his tone shifting to excitement. They stepped in, boots scuffing against the container floor, hands already reaching for the boxes. In that moment, their weapons dipped, their attention narrowing to the treasure in front of them. James's hand hovered over the small remote clipped to his belt. He waited, his breath held until all 3 were inside and the leader bent to lift one of the boxes. Then he pressed the button. The heavy steel doors swung shut with a resonant clang that reverberated through the hold. There was a brief, muffled shout from inside, followed by the thud of fists or rifle stocks against the walls. The hydraulics engaged, locking the doors tight. The sound was final, a mechanical certainty that told James this part of the board was now his. He exhaled slowly, tucking the remote away. One group neutralized, their communications cut off, their ability to warn the others gone. The real danger now was the pair still moving through the superstructure. They would be more cautious after hearing the commotion from the hold, and their path would be harder to predict. But with fewer numbers, they were at a disadvantage. As James made his way back toward the central stairwell, he kept one hand near the stun baton at his hip. He didn't plan to use it unless necessary, but in close quarters, the non-lethal shock it delivered could end a fight in seconds. The corridors here were quiet, the hum of the ship the only constant sound. Somewhere above, the two pirates would be creeping along, searching for crew, for valuables, for control. He thought of the crew sealed in the Citadel, safe for now, their trust placed entirely in him. He thought of the vastness of the sea outside, and how quickly that vastness could become a prison if the wrong men took the helm. He wasn't going to let that happen. The Sentinel was his ship, and as long as he stood, it would remain so. Now came the next move in the game, and James was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The corridors would become the new battlefield, and he would make sure the enemy never saw the winning move until it was too late. The cargo hold was silent again, save for the distant muffled pounding from inside the sealed container where the 3 pirates had been trapped. James listened for a few seconds more, making sure there were no surprises, then turned his attention back to the corridors. The game had shifted. The most aggressive part of the threat had been neutralized, but danger still prowled the ship. Somewhere in the maze of steel passageways, 2 armed men were moving with purpose, and the longer they remained free, the greater the risk that they would stumble onto something, or someone, they shouldn't. James ascended the narrow metal stairs 2 at a time, his boots ringing on the graded steps. The ship's interior seemed to grow hotter as he climbed toward the upper decks, the confined spaces holding the heat from the machinery below. In his mind, he replayed the moments on the deck cameras just before he'd left the bridge. The 2 men splitting from the rest, heading toward the superstructure. They were smart enough to know the bridge was the nerve center, but too cautious to rush it immediately. They would sweep through the crew quarters first, maybe the galley, looking for stragglers or anyone who might tell them where valuables were kept. The leader of the remaining 2 was the kind of man James had encountered before in different corners of the world. Lean, watchful, with a predator's stillness between movements. His name, James had learned from intercepted radio chatter before the attack, was Khalid, a former fisherman who had traded nets for rifles when the fishing grounds dried up and the world stopped caring about the men who lived on that shore. There was no mercy in his eyes, only the calculation of someone who saw every encounter as a transaction to be won or lost. The other, shorter and heavier, seemed to follow Khalid's lead without question. As James moved along a parallel passage that would bring him close to the crew quarters deck, he kept one hand close to the bulkhead, letting the vibrations of the ship tell him what his ears might not. The thrum of the engines was constant, but there were other notes in the steel, a faint, rhythmic clang that could be boots on a ladder, the subtle creak of a door opening against its seals. He slowed, letting those sounds guide him. Then he heard it, a sharp, metallic bang from above, followed by the low murmur of voices. They were in the galley, he realized, probably searching cupboards and lockers. The galley's double doors opened into a central corridor, with the mess hall on one side and a storage pantry on the other. It was a dead end unless you knew about the maintenance hatch behind the pantry that led into a narrow shaft down to the engine monitoring room. James knew every inch of it, and he had used that shaft before to move unseen. Instead of heading directly for the galley, he took the maintenance route, his footsteps careful, measured. The shaft was cramped, the air warm and faintly metallic. He moved quietly, emerging onto the deck just behind the galley wall. From there, he could hear the clearer sound of their movements, drawers opening, the scrape of boots on the tile floor. Khalid's voice was low, speaking in a language James didn't know, but with a tone that carried frustration. They hadn't found anything worth taking, and their patience was wearing thin. The next sound was sharper, a burst of automatic fire into the ceiling, the percussion thudding through the confined space. The message was obvious. If there were crew hiding nearby, they were to come out or face worse. James stayed still, knowing none of his crew would break from their hiding spots. They trusted him to handle this. From the corner of the galley doorway, James caught sight of them. Khalid's posture was taut, the rifle held across his body, eyes flicking constantly to the doors and windows. The other man was less disciplined, opening a cold storage locker and letting the heavy door slam. The noise was their mistake. It masked James's careful approach. He stepped into the open, stun baton in one hand, his voice cutting through the air with a command as sharp as a blade. "Drop it." It was not a request, and it had the intended effect for half a second, enough for the shorter man to hesitate, glancing toward Khalid for direction. But Khalid was too experienced to freeze. He swung the rifle up, but James was already moving, crossing the narrow space between them with speed that belied his size. The baton crackled as it met the rifle stock, sending a jolt up Khalid's arms. The weapon clattered to the floor, and James drove his shoulder into the man's chest, forcing him back against the counter. The shorter pirate lunged forward, but James twisted, letting the man's momentum carry him past. A sharp jab from the baton caught him between the shoulder blades, and he dropped to his knees with a grunt, the rifle in his hands sliding across the floor. James kicked it out of reach, his stance low, ready for Khalid's next move. But Khalid, still recovering from the first shock, was slower now. James took advantage, driving the baton into his midsection, the crackle of electricity filling the galley. The man crumpled, breath knocked out of him, and James moved quickly to bind his wrists with a length of cord from his belt pouch. The shorter man was still on the floor, dazed, and received the same treatment. The entire encounter had lasted less than a minute, but James felt the heat in his blood as if he'd been running for hours. He kept his breathing steady, listening for any sign that the noise had drawn others, but there were no others left. These were the last. With both prisoners secured, he keyed his earpiece and spoke quietly to his officers, confirming that the threat was over. The crew could remain in the citadels for now until he was certain the ship was clear. He would make sure of that personally. He guided the two men out of the galley, their wrists bound, and began the walk toward the secure storage compartment where they would be held until help arrived. Khalid walked stiffly, silent now, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though replaying his miscalculation. James didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in this beyond the relief that it was finished. When the heavy door closed behind them, the lock turning with a decisive click, the ship seemed to exhale. The corridors were quiet again, the hum of the engines steady beneath his feet. He allowed himself a moment to lean against the bulkhead, feeling the weight of the last hours settle into his shoulders. But the work wasn't done yet. The ocean sentinel still had to be swept from bow to stern, every compartment checked. The crew needed to be reassured, the ship's systems verified for any damage. And beyond that, there was the matter of the call he had made earlier to the nearest naval patrol. Help was coming, but they were still alone out here until it arrived. James pushed off the wall and started back toward the bridge. The hunt was over, but the endgame was still ahead. Soon, he would have to decide how to hand these men over, and what to say about what had happened on this ship today. When James stepped back onto the bridge, the air felt cooler. the horizon stretching wide and clear beyond the thick glass panels. The vastness of it was deceptive. Somewhere out there, the world had already begun to move in response to his earlier call. Naval ships were plotting a course toward the Ocean Sentinel, but until they arrived, the responsibility for everything within these steel walls still lay squarely on his shoulders. The 2 remaining prisoners were secured below in the storage compartment, bound and silent, while the 3 trapped in the cargo container still hammered from time to time, their frustration echoing faintly through the hull. It was over in the immediate sense, but James's instincts told him it wasn't finished until every angle had been locked down. He took a slow breath, reviewing the sequence of events in his mind, not out of doubt, but out of habit. The attack had unfolded as many of them did, starting with the distant specks on the horizon and ending with armed men on his deck. But the way it had been countered, step by step, was the product of years at sea, of knowing when to be patient and when to move. Now, with all 5 intruders under control, there was one last part of the operation to complete, a sweep of the ship and the sealing of every point they had touched. James turned to the helm and adjusted the vessel's heading just enough to keep her on a steady, fuel-efficient track while allowing him to divert his attention fully to the sweep. He left the bridge in the hands of his second officer, a quiet man named Owens, who understood the gravity of what had just happened and needed no further instruction. As James descended from the bridge, the steel steps ringing under his boots, he moved through the ship with the same measured pace he had used during the hunt, alert, deliberate, listening as much as looking. The corridors held that particular stillness that comes after chaos, where every sound feels louder than it should. The clink of his keyring against the baton at his belt seemed to carry for yards. In the crew quarters, he checked each cabin, glancing into neatly made bunks and personal lockers, making sure nothing was out of place and no one was hiding where they shouldn't be. It wasn't paranoia, it was procedure. He'd heard too many stories of attackers leaving one man behind, concealed to strike when the ship relaxed its guard. From there, he moved to the galley, the scene of his last confrontation with Khalid and his partner. The upturned chair still lay where it had fallen, and a few cupboard doors hung open, evidence of their hurried search. James closed each one, righting the chair, methodically restoring order. It was as much for the crew as for himself. When they emerged from the Citadel, he wanted them to see their ship as they had left it, not as the pirates had tried to leave it. Down in the cargo hold, the air was warmer, heavier with the smell of oil and the faint chemical tang of container paint. He approached the sealed unit where the 3 were held, listening again for the sound of movement inside. It came, a dull thump against the wall, followed by muffled voices. James didn't answer. Instead, he checked the locking mechanism, ensuring it was still fully engaged, then added an extra steel pin to the hatch for good measure. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a container door ajar farther down the row. He approached cautiously, baton ready, but it was nothing. A door that had swung open slightly when the ship rolled earlier. He secured it, then continued on, scanning the narrow lanes between stacks. The cargo was untouched. The traps he had prepared, those he hadn't needed, remained in place, silent reminders of how close the day had come to playing out differently. By the time he returned to the bridge, the sun was sliding lower in the sky, its light softening into the gold of late afternoon. Owens looked up from the navigation console and gave a single nod. "All quiet," he said simply. James returned the nod, taking his place at the helm once more. The ocean ahead lay calm, the wake trailing behind like a long white scar. Now came the matter of the final trap, not for pirates still roaming free, but for the transition from this confrontation to the arrival of help. Handing over prisoners at sea was its own operation, one that could turn tense if not handled with precision. The pirates might try to resist at the last moment, or the transfer could invite danger if word of it reached the wrong ears. James intended to make sure that when the naval ship arrived, the Ocean Sentinel would be in a position of complete control, her attackers immobilized and incapable of any last act. He keyed the internal comms to the Citadel. "It's over," he told his crew, his voice steady, the tension in it almost imperceptible. "Stay put for now. We'll bring you out when the Coast Guard is in sight." There was a pause, then a chorus of acknowledgments, the relief in their tones clear even over the static. James spent the next hour finalizing the ship's readiness. The hatches to the compartments holding the prisoners were reinforced with additional locking bars. A rotation was set for 2 officers to stand watch over each location, armed not with rifles, but with the non-lethal tools James preferred in these situations: stun batons, heavy cable ties, and the kind of resolve that didn't waver. The bridge crew maintained a vigilant watch on radar, noting the distant blip of the approaching naval vessel. It was still hours away, but each mile it closed felt like a step toward the finish. He allowed himself one moment of stillness at the forward windows, watching the horizon deepen in color as the day waned. The attack had been contained without loss of life, a fact that mattered to him more than the cargo in his hold. It wasn't leniency. These men had chosen their path and would face the consequences. But James had seen enough desperation in his life to know what pushed people to acts like this. That was a conversation for when the Coast Guard arrived, not before. For now, the ship moved on, steady and unbroken, her course true. James kept his hands on the controls, his eyes shifting between horizon and radar as the sun slipped lower and the shadow of the final phase of this day stretched ahead. Soon there would be a handover, paperwork, formal statements. But before that came the last, silent trap, the unshakable readiness that made it impossible for anyone to steal even a moment's advantage before the end. When the naval vessel finally appeared as a speck against the fading light, James was already prepared. Every door was locked, every corridor secure, every man accounted for. The game had been played to the last move, and the Ocean Sentinel remained his, unchallenged and intact. The naval vessel grew larger on the horizon with each passing minute, its gray silhouette cutting clean lines against the burnished gold of the late afternoon sea. From the bridge of the Ocean Sentinel, James watched it through the binoculars, noting the purposeful symmetry of its wake and the way the light glinted off its angular superstructure. It was a patrol ship, smaller than some of the massive destroyers he had seen in other waters, but armed and capable, and most importantly, bringing the authority of law to these lawless stretches of ocean. The sight of it was the final assurance that the events of the last hours were drawing to their close, though James knew that nothing truly ended until the prisoners were off his ship and in custody. He set the binoculars down and adjusted the ship's heading slightly to facilitate the transfer. Owens, still at his post at the navigation console, kept a steady eye on the radar while relaying their position to the patrol ship via secure channel. The coordination was precise, both vessels maneuvering to bring them within safe operational range without sacrificing the tactical advantage of distance until the moment of boarding. James's voice on the comms was calm, clipped and professional, answering questions from the naval officers, confirming the number of prisoners and their status, describing the locations in which they were being held. The responses from the other side were equally measured. They were clearly impressed that a civilian vessel had managed to contain an armed boarding without a single casualty among its crew. The crew, still secured in the citadels deep within the ship, had begun to sense that the end was near. Through the internal system, James gave them the update they had been waiting for. The Coast Guard vessel was on station and preparing to board. He instructed them to remain where they were until given the all-clear, his voice carrying that same unyielding steadiness that had guided them through the attack. In moments like these, reassurance mattered as much as information. As the patrol ship closed the gap, the details came into view. The gun mounts on its deck, the small group of uniformed personnel clustered near the boarding area, the rigid-hulled inflatable boat being lowered into the water. The transfer would be conducted in stages. First, the boarding team would come aboard the Sentinel to take custody of the prisoners. Then, once the situation was confirmed secure, the crew would be released from the citadels. James had seen this process before, though never from the position of the captain whose ship had been under attack. He felt the weight of that difference now. The inflatable boat skimmed across the water toward them, its outboard motor churning up a froth of white. James moved to the wing of the bridge, watching as the boarding team approached, their helmets and tactical vests dark against the glare of the sea. They came alongside with practiced precision, lines thrown and secured, and then they were climbing up the Sentinel's gangway, their movements economical without wasted motion. James met them at the designated point, offering a brief, firm handshake to the officer in charge. His report was succinct but thorough. 5 pirates captured, 3 in a secured cargo container, 2 in the storage compartment below, all disarmed, all restrained, none injured beyond the shock of non-lethal takedown methods. The officer listened carefully, nodding, his gaze occasionally sweeping the surrounding deck as his men moved to their assigned tasks. Within minutes, 2 were escorting James toward the cargo hold to inspect the first group of prisoners. The sound of the hydraulics releasing the container's lock was a deep mechanical groan. When the doors swung open, the 3 pirates inside squinted into the sudden light, their postures a mixture of defiance and resignation. They were ordered out one by one, cuffed, and led toward the waiting boat. James observed in silence, his face impassive. This was no time for triumph. It was the completion of a necessary duty, nothing more. In the storage compartment below, Khalid and his companion were similarly retrieved. Khalid's eyes met James's for the briefest moment as the naval officers took hold of his arms. There was no plea, no visible anger, only a long, measuring look, as though committing the captain's face to memory. James returned it steadily before turning away to sign the initial custody documents the boarding officer presented. Once the last of the prisoners had been taken off the Sentinel, the officer asked if James wished to make any additional remarks for the official record. For a moment, the captain hesitated. Then he spoke, his words deliberate, each chosen with care. He described the attack plainly, but when he spoke of the men themselves, his voice shifted slightly. These men had committed crimes, he said, and would answer for them. But he also knew the kind of desperation that bred such acts. Villages with no work, seas stripped of fish by industrial fleets, young men who saw no path forward except through violence. "I ask you," James said, meeting the officer's eyes, "to remember that when you decide their fate, justice can be firm without being blind to the reasons behind the crime." The officer regarded him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Noted, Captain," he said before signaling to his men to proceed. The prisoners were loaded into the inflatable, which sped back toward the patrol ship. The entire transfer had taken less than an hour, but it felt longer, each step a careful movement in a process that balanced security with the need for closure. When the patrol vessel turned away, the distance between them widening again, James gave the order to bring the crew out of the citadels. They emerged in small groups, blinking against the light, their voices rising in a wave of relief and subdued congratulations. There was no cheering, just the quiet acknowledgement of a crew that understood how close they had come to a very different ending. James moved among them, clasping shoulders, exchanging a few low words with each. The ship had been tested, and so had they, and both had held. By the time the Ocean Sentinel resumed her original course, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, laying a path of molten light across the waves. James stood on the bridge once more, the deck below alive with the sound of the crew returning to their duties. The air was cooler now, the sharpness of the day's tension replaced by a steadier rhythm. He let his gaze travel across the sea, the patrol ship now a faint smudge in the distance, and felt the quiet satisfaction that came not from victory, but from the knowledge that his ship, his crew, and their cargo were safe. The events of the day would be written into reports, dissected in meetings, perhaps even retold in shipping circles as an example of discipline and quick thinking. But for James, it would remain something simpler, the story of a day when the ocean had tested him, and he had met it with the calm of a man who knew both its dangers and its worth. As the bow of the Ocean Sentinel parted the evening swells, he kept his hand steady on the helm, guiding her forward into the deepening blue, ready for whatever the sea might bring next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Check out our other videos for more, and share this one with friends who'll enjoy it.